about it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have the pleasure here to present Silvia Breiburd, which I'm so happy. I'm so really very excited and really happy to have met Silvia personally at the Artisol conference, which was recently held in Salta. So Silvia, she's our generational expert, and I'm really happy to have you here to hear more about your insights.
Well, thank you so much, Lore, for everything. And thanks for inviting me to share a little bit of my passion. And you know that I'm passionate about this. And talking about generations is what really drives my professional life at present. And well, thanks for the invitation. And I'm here to answer all the questions. And if you don't have any questions, so far I've brought mine so that I can share them with you. And start like enchanting everybody with this idea of what to follow a generational perspective or to adhere to a generational perspective is and why it is so important at present. But to get started, I'd love you to start thinking about your childhood memories, whatever memories you remember. Try and go to those international situations or national situations that really struck your attention, that were so remarkable for you at the time that you still remember where you were, who you were with, what you were doing, what you were wearing, the smells around you. And just going back to those days, perhaps will take you to the feelings that you got as you were experiencing those historical events, remarkable events, situations that marked you at the end of your primary or secondary school years. Do you happen to remember them, Lore?
I was thinking about historical events, and one of them stuck in my mind, which was the World Cup that we played against. Was it? I think. Oh my God! It was the one in Italy, 1990, where we were, almost there. We were sub-champions, and it meant so much to me because it was watching a soccer game with your family. And on a color and a color TV, normal, regular. Kids don't know maybe what I'm talking about, with pressing buttons to change your channels, no remote.
You're mentioning so many events that can relate to the theory of generation and understanding different generational perspectives. But let's take that event in the 90s and the feelings. You know that normally when we tend to think of generational markers, which are those events that are set according to the theory of generations, a theory developed by Karl Mankin in the past century and like taken over by different sociologists with the turn of the century. But talking about these events, we tend to think of bad things that affect us and that mark the way we perceive reality. Because in the end, when we talk about generational markers, and you know that I tend to use my signature classes, I refer to the filters that we develop as generations, as groups of people who go through similar life events that mark and in a way affect the filters that are used to perceive reality. And normally we tend to think of bad things like events that marked us in a negative way, but World Cups also have a lot of importance because thinking about celebration, family moments shared by large groups of people also constitute generational markers. And you know that different generations that coexist now in any academic ambit have faced different World Cups. And the feelings are very much related to the spirit at the time. If we come to think of the different generations, and I have to say that at least there are like 7 generations coexisting in any educational ambit. Like if we think about the traditionalists, that are those individuals born up to the year 1945, approximately, who have retired, but who have left the structure, the educational structure we need to use and we need to adhere to on an everyday basis. And if we think about the different generations that coexist and their perceptions and generational markers, we can understand how much, for instance, a World Cup affects the perceptions of the different individuals in a school. Let's move backwards, but let's start with the closest event we can think of. If we think about the recent World Cup Argentina has won, or Argentina won, in fact, we can think about how the youngest generations are being marked by not only that World Cup, but what has come afterwards. This idea of learning to wait till you get what you need or what you want. Thinking about the kinds of idols that are like shown or depicted through the World Cups themselves. In this case, the heroes and heroines that are behind any achievement. And one can think of Lionel Messi as a figure that will be marking generations, but not only from the point of view of the sport that he practices or for which he is famous, but as an example of a hero to follow, like the kind of human being who makes extraordinary things and adds that little extra to ordinary, and that still very much adheres to family values, to taking care of daily activities, and with a close relationship with children. If we think about that, well, that is going to mark the youngest generations, learning to defer gratification, learning to wait till you get your prize, learning to recover from failure. And think about that in particular, think about the first match, and which is very, very different from the feelings that children who were facing the previous World Cups experienced as they were watching or witnessing those international events. I can think about me and more or less at the same age, like being 8 or 9, and the 1978 Cup, right? When, you know, that I adhere to the values of the Generation X, a generation that is said to be very dark and pessimistic. And no wonder Generation X, those born in between the year 1964 and 1980, for instance, are said to be dark. While we were in our teen years, we witnessed the fall of Berlin Wall, for instance, the appearance of AIDS. And if you think about it, every single institution in life collapsed. And no wonder, and I do make a point here because some of or a great number of parents still today adhere to the values of this generation. So no wonder they approach educational institutions with a feeling of distrust, which is not the feeling that other families bring to or other generations have regarding institutions. But think about this. This generation of parents witnessed a World Cup in which not even results could be trusted. And I can still remember the song like, and you could sing that and they would say 6-0 contra Peru, 6-0. 6-0. That was what was needed and that was what was achieved. But nobody really thought that that was absolutely honest. And the way we witnessed that match was not out of an effort. There was always distrust of the result in the World Cup. And the heroes and heroines in the period were black and white. There was something that was very remarkable about them, but something that was very, let's say, gray in their lives. Think about Maradona, Michael Jackson, Madonna. This idea of they were human, absolutely human, but their bright side was, or paired their dark side. And this is how we approach generations, or how this generation approaches life. Like, it could fail. There may be a B side. Let's have a plan B in case something happens, because it may happen and it will happen.
That's a great insight, Sylvie. As you were mentioning these different generational aspects, I start thinking about how, as language educators, we can use this knowledge of generationals and how they are different from each other to plan our classes, our language classes, and what that would mean to us.
Well, this is great because, first of all, you need to know where we are standing. Apart from being teachers or learners of a language, we are human beings who adhere to the values of a certain generation. And adhering to the values of a generation implies that there are certain ways in which we want to transmit or receive knowledge, certain ways of, for instance, adhering to projects or rejecting projects, certain ways of defining respect and what we expect from situations. So all generations want to be respected. What is understood by respect, and this is not me, this is just Shaw, who founded 12 different situations under which the different generations disagree. What is understood by respect is something that changes depending on your generational perceptions. So thinking about the way in which we face, for instance, any situation, and adhering to the values that we all have tattooed through socialization, we can understand better where we are standing either as teachers or learners of a foreign language. And in as far as we can respond to that, we will be more effective. So, for instance, one of the different ways in which the generations differ has to do with feedback, how we want our feedback. So if it is only positive or negative, if it is immediate or at the end of a process. So if you're thinking about leaderships and providing feedback to your teachers, for instance, thinking about teachers of a language, you have to think about when you find the right moment and the right way to provide feedback, because probably that feedback will be better received and incorporated if it is given in a generational friendly way, for instance. And same thing happens because teachers of a language have this characteristic. You may be a novice teacher with students who adhere to older generations, or be a very experienced teacher teaching very young students or learners. So bearing that generational gap will help you just try to avoid generational conflicts. By the way, tensions will be there. Generational tensions are inevitable, but the conflict is preventable, in the sense that if I can bear the generational gap in mind, I will be more effective and more results oriented.
Great. I like that. So I noticed you mentioned respect as a marker of, how it is perceived generationally. Also, how we give feedback. What happens with the attention span between generations and the different tasks and activities that we can take on, considering different generational differences?
Well, it's very interesting, Laura, what you're asking about, because think about planning and the planning we do for our classes, and the possibility of changing our planning too. In the past, planning could be done in terms of longer units in which students could see at the end of a very long unit, the fruits of their efforts. The youngest generations need constant feedback all the time. Think about the way in which they learn. They mostly have a video game approach, which means that they need constant feedback all the time. So if you think about that, learning that is supported through any type of specific feedback, and you can call it artificial intelligence or immediate feedback by a human being, that will help them. Another thing that counts a lot in connection with how the youngest generations prefer to learn is through visual formats. We have all become more visual. The use of screens has turned our approach to learning in like more visual formats. And I'm talking about adults who learn to read through a gradual book-based approach. But what happens when most of your reading happens through a screen and you scroll down all the time? You develop different patterns because you exercise what you are doing, and you develop skills according to what you exercise. So in the end, even the reading patterns of the youngest generations tend to be different. They need more visual support. And by the way, storytelling has a lot to do here, because storytelling is visual and it allows them to engage, to connect through empathy, and at the same time to be able to detect differences and similarities in a much context-related way. So that helps our generations to learn better too.
That is great. I like that approach. So this is like a question that I would like to ask in terms of, so we study generational approaches, and are we being, kind of like, are we being impersonal or taking sides, let's say, when we put everyone in the same bag? Like, are we overgeneralizing or generalizing in a way that can take away the personal aspect when we, classify generation?
Yeah, I understand what your point is. Let me go for a disclaimer. When we're talking about generations, we talk about populations of individuals. I mean, we are not stereotyping in the sense that we're just describing populations. Nobody would object to describing how a patient suffering from COVID feels, because we are not talking about how you develop COVID if you got it. We are just making generalizations that have to do with populations. Under certain circumstances, most probably 80%, 90% of the population may adhere or may develop the symptoms or something like that. Well, in this case, when we are talking about generations, we do have the same thing. Like, people may adhere or may not adhere to the values of their generation. In fact, we're talking about social science. So when we talk about the different generations, we are talking about like differences that have been marked in a very broad way, because social changes do not happen from one day to the other. It is not that up to the 31st of December, you are one generation and then you immediately are falling to the other generation. Like generations, there is a line that tends to blur. And in fact, people that share the values of two generations, that are standing between two generations, are very useful because they share the perceptions and feelings of two generations at the time. Normally we have a first wave, and then after that we have a second wave, which is more generation pure, in the sense that it has more the characteristics of the generation. But in the meantime, we have like what we call cuspers, like between the generation X and the millennials. We have the senials, which are a mixture of generation X that started using technology through their mobile devices. So, and like that, we have a generation in between generation Z and Alpha. So there is no black or white line dividing them. The idea is bearing in mind that, first of all, individuality counts, because I cannot predict the way the person that I'm going to talk to or I'm facing will behave. It has to do with the sociological aspect, plus, which is the generational one, plus the individual aspect, which has to do with where I decide to stand, how I adhere to the different generational values or not, and how I interpret and react to the generational perceptions that I may or may not adhere to. So that would be the disclaimer. But what is surprising, and this is the great value that I tend to say, is that first of all, if we develop this generational perception, if we start to think the way the kind of world our students are experiencing, if we go back to our own perceptions and feelings and we try to see how we saw the world, and we go back to this moment in life and we try to see how does it feel, what is the feeling that they get when there was a whole pandemic, which is a social event, a generational marker for sure. How does it feel when I am trying to make sense of the world, of what it is like to be a human being, what it is like to be um, a social being in my society, and trying to see the values of my society. How is it, how do I feel? What sense do I make of what is going on in reality? What are the contradictions? You know, this question of the real world and the virtual world, which is something that they are born into, and they do not know of a world that is not divided both into the real and the virtual, and what way do they have? So understanding this is what makes us really rethink the way we approach teaching and learning and research. Because if we cannot think of the new perceptions, then we are standing on our own parameters, and maybe we will lose validity there. So this is my generational call. Start thinking the way they do. Start seeing the world through the perception of the youngest generations, generations that do not know of a world without the internet, that want everything on demand, with others, and right now.
I love that. I love that. And thank you for joining. We have Graciela Martin here in our audience. So Graciela, thank you for coming. And if you have a question for Sylvie, I'll be happy to read it out from the chat, from our Facebook comment section. In the meantime, I wanted to say something in relation to what you just mentioned. I think that one of the best way, I'm not saying the best way, but one of the great ways to connect and start this conversation of our personal intergenerational experiences, I think, is through stories. Because, you know, you mentioned that before, and how we connect and how we can establish that conversation of understanding each other, developing empathy through those means, and how it is so relevant now that we consider this approach to into our teaching practice, and why it would be a great addition to our tools, let's say, to plan and design our classes. So I don't know if you have any other closing words to say, Sylvie, but it was a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Lore. What I believe is that I want to infuse on everyone this passion for generational perceptions, like to raise an awareness on the fact that although we are all different, and we have so many barriers that separate us, generational perceptions and the generational perspective allows us to transcend the barriers. Think about this. People in India are talking about India, the caste system, nothing to do with what we know as a class system, like just a different type of social organization on the other side of the world, just the opposite hemisphere, and they are talking about Generation Alpha. So there are so many things that we can share in our difference. And when you see the power of generational perspectives that transcends barriers of race, ethnicity, the economy and social differences, that shows us that we teachers have a lot to learn from one another, but that we can share the tools that we discover, because what works with one generation and one part of the world works with that generation all over the world. And this is very empowering, and at the same time brings about a feeling of collegiality and shared passion that I really want to make it like catching, like any disease, but a good one.
Great. That's great, Sylvie. I'm sure that everyone who listen or who will be listening to the recording of this session will be inspired that you by your approach, by the insights that you so kindly share with us, and by the collegiality that you mentioned, which is something that we're trying to build here in this expert teacher tip, like a way for us to contribute to the language education community by means of bringing together different types of experts that can share their passion, their research, and their expertise with us, so we can also incorporate that into our classes. So thank you so much, Sylvie, for joining us today. And I'm so happy to have you here and
Thank
to
you,
have
Lore,
personally met you.
Thank you, Lore, for the invitation. It's been great meeting you in person. You know that although this is true of the generations, they want the virtual side, but they want the real hug as well. So it's great to be able to, and no matter what, there is something that we all value, which is human contact and learning from others. So thanks again for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm always here and ready to help.
Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Lore.